So there's short-term and long-term complications of circumcision. So some of the short-term stuff is, you know, the shock, the bleeding, the pain, fractures that can occur because there's no anaesthetic and you're lying down flat and someone comes at you with a knife for your genitals. It's quite a scary thing, and people move. Often shoulders will break, ribs would break. I've seen a young girl who broke her leg from that. There's the long-term complications. The HIV transmission stuff is really, really interesting, especially in places where HIV education is not well known, and ways of people contracting HIV. I know in Somalia, and this is what part of my PhD topic is looking at the link between FGM and HIV transmissions, especially when there's not great sanitation around the instruments that people are using. There's also the labour complications around if you've stuff around bleeding. If someone's turned up late, they're at like stage 2, and they haven't, birth plans aren't made in Africa. You just turn up and you give birth. Whereas in New Zealand, I'd met a woman who was 37 weeks pregnant and hadn't spoken to her LMC about the fact that she had circumcision, and they've never made plans for it. She's never examined her. So that was quite an interesting thing, what's going to happen when she gives birth.
Yes. When you've been sewn up like that, do you have to be cut to give birth?
Yes, defibrillation. So it's a small cut. It can happen. In New Zealand, we encourage it at 24 weeks for the woman to go. But often people say, why would I get cut if I'm, going to be cut and I'll be in pain when I'm giving birth? So that hasn't worked out great. But often, often, they'll get just a small cut. And we also encourage it before marriage as well, for women to come in and have a cut, because to break through that scar tissue is quite painful for both. It's really encouraged that people, but there's not much uptake on people coming in before marriage, because one of the women had said to us, what happens if my husband gets hit by a bus the morning of our wedding? How are we going to determine that, people aren't going to think that I've slept around and just am wide open? So what we have ended up doing is the doctor that performs the little operation will give a certificate to say that for medical reasons this woman had to be opened up. So most people just get it done, 3-4 months after marriage when they've just had trouble. So there's not much uptake on both ends.
So can I just ask, is that covered? So if you do a referral in, they will be, I know different DHBs are going to have different referral criteria, but huge wait list to get it done?
In Auckland, if we often have a really good referral pathway. The FGM program has a gynecologist, obstetrician person that just will do it within 2 weeks. We recently did some education in Hamilton and Wellington, and in Wellington, the community ladies would recommend that the woman go to the pharmacist and get a numbing cream, and until we broke the scar tissue, just keep applying the numbing cream. And this one guy got really fed up, so he just applied a whole heap of numbing cream and took a knife to it and cut it, which we definitely don't recommend. Different communities practice differently, and I know in Wellington and in Hamilton, we haven't had people haven't gone to get defibrillation done. Area of work, I guess.
At what age are the women usually circumcised, and does it vary country by country?
Yeah, so in West Africa, it's mostly 13 to 16, and it's often in group settings. So in every village, there's maybe 1 or 2 circumcisers, and they'll host a massive party, and they'll do all the girls at the same time. In other parts, like Indonesia, it's done in the hospital. So it's as soon as the female baby is born, she gets taken away. The parents don't even have a real consent to it. It just gets done. In Kurdistan, which is really, really interesting, the girls at the age of 6 get taken away from their family unit by a stranger, someone they don't know, in the middle of the night. They get circumcised, and then a few weeks later, once they've healed, get reintegrated and never talk about it.
Do they know that's going to happen?
No. So it's a different sort of way of looking at it, I guess, because in African culture it's very talked about and it's very celebrated. In other cultures it's very secretive. And then in 2010, the Human Rights Watch group went in and did this huge look at the Kurdish community in Iran and in Iraq, and with that they produced a document called A Handful of Ash, and then there was a documentary filmmaker that went in, because a lot of the women had never really talked about it and didn't really know what happened. So once the documentary was made, it was the quickest community behaviour shift change we've seen in terms of FGM elimination. It's almost down to about 10 to 15%. So it was like it was such a decline and a shift, and it educated both men and women, and it really unpacked the issues of culture and why are we doing this. Whereas in other communities, they really haven't done that. And I also think a lot of the programs are based on this monetary incentive. You come to a training, you get paid. So how much are people really taking in if I'm just there to get paid for coming? And a lot of the time, with a lot of the programs in Africa, it is just people show up to get paid, really, and not really take in the message. And it's not done from within, it's other people coming in saying, this is wrong and this is why you shouldn't do it, rather than the community being empowered and saying, we no longer want to practice. So this is an 18-month-old girl who was circumcised, but they didn't leave enough room for an introitus, an opening. So in this picture, she was taken to hospital because she just wasn't peeing, and once she opened up, that's what happened. The psychological stuff, there's not much written on it. So for a child, it'd be, the fear, the loss, the anxiety around being portrayed by people you're supposed to trust. Often, it's said in the Kurdish community, often it's family, like the mother, the grandmother, the aunties, that will circumcise the child. So it's really hard to sort of decipher the PTSD stuff, because is it the refugee experience that's created all this trauma, or it's really hard to get at the initial circumcision trauma, because it's almost trauma built upon trauma. But also in Western countries, we're seeing more of girls who aren't circumcised that are being stigmatised, alienated, and all of that type of stuff. So it's both sides. So the idea of culture is like the colour of your eyes. You can't change it, you can't hide it. you can't see it yourself, but it's visible and obvious to others. So it's this idea that our cultural lens that we view stuff really impacts whether we like it or not. So it's really checking your unconscious bias, like really examining your own values and beliefs around issues and how you address those issues with other women. The idea that, you know, if someone puts their hands on their hips and looks at you and goes, "What have you done to yourself?" Is quite traumatic, especially when you're new to a country. The lack of I don't think you have to be a cultural expert in every culture. It's very unrealistic. But just having cultural sensitivity and just understanding that different people have different experiences and their experiences will impact the way they view health as well. Involving fathers in sexual health issues or husbands in sexual health issues. For some cultures it's okay, for others it's a no-go. I remember when my mum was giving birth to my younger sister and the nurses were inviting my dad to go in and watch my mum give birth, and she was like, no. But they were just really insistent that he go and do this, and it's not a part of our culture. Like, you hold the baby once it's clean a few hours later and not involved in childbirth. So it was just like a really different experience that they just weren't used to. And my dad kept asking my mum, "Why do these women want me to come and see this?" Like, this isn't. But apparently, it's very normal in European culture where the father of the child is present at birth, which it's just really different. The way you communicate things, especially around first-time parents, like once defibrillation occurs at small cut and she's open, really talking about the bodily changes that will occur. So for a woman that's had FGM and who hasn't been opened up, takes about 23 minutes to empty her bladder. So really talking about, it takes quite a long time, and even taking a week, most school-age children take a week off school to manage their period pains because the antroitus isn't big enough and it's coming out slowly. And counselling is a foreign concept, which it is. No one talks about their issues with other people. So really, if trauma has occurred, it's good to talk about it, but finding other ways that people can talk. So I run a mothers group, and it's a 3-hour-long group, and the women for 2.5 hours just sit there and talk to each other. And that's their counselling, that's their therapy, about talking about what's going on. And in time, they'll be able to discuss their own issues with a supportive environment. But this idea that you go and see someone, you sit in a room and you talk about your feelings just doesn't exist. So some consideration is use interpreters when possible, even if you get phone interpreting. It's super important not to use a family member or a child to interpret. I had this one woman who went to the doctor with her child and had said, "I've got severe pain. I feel like I've got 70 horses running on my back." And the child directly translated it, instead of saying, she's got extreme pain in her back, translated it word for word, which made her sound a bit crazy. And there was something wrong with her mentally, and that's how the doctor took it, that there was something mentally wrong. And it started this process of, getting her to go to the outpatient mental health clinic and things like that, but didn't really address her initial issues. So really using professional interpreters, because that's what they are. They can understand the medical stuff and sort of decipher the cultural nuances of the way people talk as well. So that's highly encouraged. Understanding a little bit about the issues that might affect the woman is really important. So we're having a basic understanding of FGM, understanding the refugee process that person has gone. You don't need to know everything that's happened, but just understanding some of the stuff that's happened along their journey. Being aware of your own power relationship with the patient, that's super important, because I come from a culture where what the doctor says is what it is, and they know what's best and what's wrong. Whereas in a system where you know your own body well, you know what's not right, what feels right to you, it can be taken very literal, and that just being aware of your position and power in that relationship is really important. Providing all the options that are available to the patient. I really recommend the culturally and linguistically diverse community resources. You can sign up for the different trainings they run. It really does give an insight to refugee and migrant health and the different issues that are there. Okay, so I've got a case study in front of you. Have a read of it, and then have a read of it and talk to your the person next to you around what considerations may you need to make, or what things do you need to think about. Just maybe a few key notes that you guys might have noted in the case study. Key things that you think would have been important. Does anyone want to share?
Yeah, sure. So we thought that the system should have been more adequate from the beginning, so that there should be more support. Health professionals should have picked it up earlier, like when she was pregnant, and having birth should have picked up what was going on. What to develop trust. That if you're the provider, you need to develop trust, and they putting her in touch with the specialist services like Shakti, and seems like she's really isolated, and she probably needs community support. What else? Maybe talk to her about why the GP, or maybe the GP needs to know what's happening.
My biggest thing was that she needs an advocate, somebody who really understands her and can walk alongside her. I think there's so much stuff here, and it's also finding out what's your biggest priority, because there's not us. I can't decide for her what her most crushing issue is. But it is definitely getting an advocate, somebody who can speak with her, translate where it's necessary, know where she's coming from, because even what you just told me today has blown me away and made me feel incredibly ignorant.
Any other group want to share?
Now that she's revealed these things, I think you've got to, I mean, she needs an advocate, but we were discussing this in the real world, where do you get these advocates from? So I think, as a GP, you need to break this down to slightly bite-sized pieces. And if she's finally revealed these issues, you say, okay, we need to deal with the gynecological aspects, we need to get you some help to deal with the legal aspects, and we need to get you some help to deal with the social aspects. And, although it's all part of a whole, it might be more manageable to say, okay, this is what we should do. If with your agreement, this is what perhaps we need to work on today.
It all sounds wonderful. And in fact, that is sort of what happened in this case, was she did get an advocate through the FGM program. They were able to advocate on the legal stuff and find her a good lawyer and to be able to talk through that. Did get her some help in terms of therapy for the sexual violence stuff, and was able to communicate with her doctor or medical issues that were happening for her. It's a great way to round off. So do check out the FGM education, well, fgm.co.nz. It's got a bunch of great resources, including guidelines for childbirth and delivery, child protective guidelines. There's a list of, there's a resource with all the different countries that practice FGM and what the likelihood of it happening is. Yeah, so a bunch of great resources, very New Zealand specific, and talks about the communities. And yeah, at any point feel free to email or get in contact with the FGM education program. It's an issue that you might never see or one that you might see. It's just being aware of it. Yeah.
Can I just ask something? For women, for girls that are born in New Zealand, is it still happening in New Zealand?
It's a really hard one to answer. It's the short answer is we've never had a prosecution, but in saying that, Australia just had their first prosecution last year. We've got anecdotal evidence to say that there is the potential of it happening, and just in the last 6 months we've done community needs assessment from communities in Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch and Auckland, and the community's concern is that there is a high risk of it happening. But it's one of those things that even if it was to happen, unless something went drastically wrong, we'd never really know. Yeah, but I think it's just, we haven't had a prosecution, so that doesn't take away the risk, but I hope that answered your question.
Can I just ask, I mean, I'm trained in the UK and I was an FGM specialist health visitor for the communities that I worked with in the UK. And obviously there's different the guidance we have there. What are the powers here for informing the police, Sis, if you've got a suspicion that a child is being taken or being taken out of the country? Because obviously back in the UK we were to inform the police would remove the passport, there would be the child would be potentially removed from that family if there was a risk to that child?
We have similar guidelines. Yeah. So we do have a child protection guiding principles that can be used, and if necessary, yeah, passports could be revoked and all of that. And I think a few years ago we did have to sort of use that channel. We had a Maori lady who converted to Islam in Indonesia, and she was in Indonesia, fell in love with this guy, got married, and one day his aunties turned up on a motorbike and took her away and circumcised her. She was 25 at the time. So when she came to New Zealand and they had daughters and the husband wanted to take them to Indonesia, she had a fear that the same aunties will come and circumcise their daughters. So yeah, we did have to go through that process of actually assessing the risk and how likely it was going to be. They never ended up going to Indonesia because the husband said, okay, well, I don't want, cause like he just didn't know that happened to her. So yeah, and there is, you know, if it was to happen, if circumcision happens and the prosecution is, I think 7 years 7 years imprisonment, and that's been a real deterrence for communities. But in saying that, our current definition in the Crimes Act is only infibulation. So type 1 and type 2 FGM or even type 4 FGM isn't actually illegal. So that's something that we've been working through, trying to actually amend the definition to fit and encompass the whole of what FGM is. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering about because, you know, like circumcision on people with a penis is really common in New Zealand, and most people aren't up in arms about it. But given that like most people would totally agree that it's not okay to circumcise vaginas, like it would be quite, I imagine like within a community, if somebody's like, oh, I don't actually think it should be happening, It's very hard to come forward and talk about or tell somebody about it, because also chances are SIFs aren't going to go into a white man and take the penis circumcised child away, but that might happen, like, so it must be heaps of barriers to do within that community.
And I think, getting your child taken away from you is something that a lot of families worry about, especially now that in Europe it's happening more common, and that's just been something, because we've got quite a relatively new population. It's quite different for us. We haven't got to that stage where there's enough of us saying, actually, we think this is wrong, and it is only wrong in the context of consent, because what's the difference between female circumcision and vaginoplasty, which is the third growing plastic surgery in the world? And a lot of the young girls are, if you've seen the documentary called My Perfect Vagina, where this girl thinks her labias are too long and wants to get them chopped up, what is the difference between that? Are we saying that's okay, that you can, if you choose, you can go and remove or reshape your labias, to someone saying, well, this is a part of my culture and I want to do this? What's the real difference? And I think all of it really just comes down to consent. FGM, majority of the time, is done to children under the age of 17.
Do you have information in terms of from our refugees coming from Syria? What's the usual for Syrian women or girls? Is there a percent yet in terms of...
Actually, till this document came out in December of last year, we've never thought of Syria as being a population that circumcises. And one, we don't really go around doing vaginal examinations and things like that. So it's really hard to know where that is. And even with the report, it was saying that it occurs, but it wasn't descriptive enough to say, this is a population. And it's something that even the UN WHO actually hasn't looked at Syria as a FGM practicing country before. So I think it's an area of research.